The morning mist clung to the ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip on the ancient peaks that had witnessed countless secrets. In the small town of Blowing Rock, North Carolina, the autumn of 1987 painted the landscape in brilliant oranges and deep crimsons, a beauty that masked the darkness about to unfold. Three lifelong friends, Marcus Webb, David Chen, and Tommy Rodriguez, stood at the edge of the Pisgah National Forest, their backpacks loaded with enough supplies for what should have been a simple 3-day camping trip. Marcus, 22 and fresh out of Appalachian State University, had grown up hiking these trails with his grandfather. His weathered hiking boots had carried him through countless adventures in these mountains, and he knew the terrain better than most park rangers. David, the quiet one of the group, worked at his family's restaurant in town and had saved for months to buy the new camping gear that now weighed heavy on his shoulders. Tommy, always the joker, bounced on his heels with nervous energy, cracking jokes to mask his unease about venturing so deep into the wilderness. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear how it unfolds, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more mysterious tales like this one. The three had been inseparable since middle school, bonding over their shared love of the outdoors and their dreams of adventure beyond the confines of their small mountain town. Now, as young adults facing the crossroads of life, Marcus considering graduate school, David planning to expand his family's business, and Tommy preparing to leave for basic training, this camping trip felt like a farewell to their childhood. A final adventure before responsibility scattered them to different paths. They had chosen a remote section of the forest, miles from the popular camping areas where families and casual hikers gathered. Marcus had convinced his friends that the solitude would be worth the extra effort, promising them pristine wilderness and the kind of peace that only the deep woods could provide. The trail they planned to follow was an old logging road that had been abandoned decades earlier, now overgrown with mountain laurel and rhododendron, barely visible except to those who knew where to look. As they set off that crisp October morning, their breath visible in the cool air, none of them could have imagined that within 72 hours, two of them would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only questions that would haunt their families and their community for nearly 15 years. The mountains that had always been their playground would become their prison, and the friendship that had defined their lives would be tested in ways that would break one of them completely. The first day of hiking passed without incident. They made good time along the old logging road, stopping frequently to admire the spectacular fall foliage and to photograph the sweeping vistas that opened up at various points along the ridge. Tommy's constant chatter filled the spaces between their footsteps, his commentary on everything from the unusual warmth of the weather to his theories about what they might encounter in the wilderness. David walked quietly behind the others, occasionally pointing out interesting flora or warning about loose rocks on the trail. By late afternoon, they had reached their planned campsite, a small clearing beside a mountain stream that Marcus remembered from childhood trips with his grandfather. The spot was perfect, flat ground for their tents, fresh water for cooking and cleaning, and a natural windbreak provided by a semicircle of towering hemlocks. As they set up camp, the familiar rhythms of their friendship emerged. Marcus took charge of organizing their gear, David focused on gathering firewood and preparing their evening meal, while Tommy entertained them with increasingly elaborate stories about his conquests and misadventures. The evening passed peacefully around their campfire, the three friends sharing stories and dreams as they had done countless times before. The flames danced against the darkness of the surrounding forest, creating a cocoon of warmth and light that felt safe and eternal. They talked about their childhood adventures, their plans for the future, and the changes that were coming to their lives. There was a bitter-sweet quality to their conversation, an acknowledgement that this might be their last adventure together as the carefree friends they had always been. As the fire died down to glowing embers, they retreated to their tents with plans to wake early and explore a waterfall that Marcus remembered from his grandfather's stories. The night sounds of the forest surrounded them. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the gentle murmur of the stream over smooth stones. It was the kind of peace that city dwellers dream about, the deep quiet that only comes from being miles away from civilization. None of them slept particularly well that first night. The sounds of the forest, familiar during the day, took on an ominous quality in the darkness. Every snapping twig or distant animal call seemed amplified, and more than once, one of them would lie awake, listening intently to sounds they couldn't quite identify. Tommy, usually the first to fall asleep anywhere, found himself staring at the ceiling of his tent, feeling an inexplicable unease that he couldn't shake. Years later, he would remember that feeling and wonder if some part of him had sensed what was coming. Dawn broke grey and overcast, a stark contrast to the brilliant sunshine of the previous day. The temperature had dropped significantly during the night, and a light drizzle began to fall as they packed up their campsite. Marcus suggested they adjust their plans, perhaps exploring some of the closer trails rather than attempting the longer hike to the waterfall, but his friends were eager to stick to their original itinerary. They had limited time together, and none of them wanted to waste it playing it safe. The trail to the waterfall was more challenging than Marcus had remembered. What had seemed like a well-defined path in his childhood memories now appeared as little more than deer trails and game paths that intersected and diverged with confusing frequency. The drizzle made the rocks slippery and the fallen leaves treacherous underfoot. More than once, they had to stop and backtrack when the trail seemed to disappear entirely, swallowed by the dense undergrowth of the mountain forest. It was during one of these moments of confusion, as they stood at a fork in what barely qualified as a trail, that they encountered the first sign that their adventure was about to take a dark turn. David, who had been bringing up the rear, called out that he thought he had seen someone watching them from the trees. When the others turned to look, they saw nothing but the grey shadows of the forest, but David insisted that he had glimpsed a figure among the hemlocks, someone who had quickly disappeared when spotted. Tommy laughed it off, suggesting that David had been spooked by the gloomy weather and his own imagination, but Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. His grandfather had told stories about these remote areas of the forest, tales of people who had chosen to live off the grid, away from society and its rules. Most of the stories were harmless enough, eccentric hermits and mountain men who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. But some carried darker implications about what drove people to seek such complete isolation. As they continued deeper into the forest, following what they hoped was the correct trail, the feeling of being watched persisted. Several times one of them would catch a glimpse of movement in their peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing but trees and shadows. The forest seemed to press in around them, the grey light filtering through the canopy, creating an atmosphere of unease that grew stronger with each passing hour. They never found the waterfall that day. Instead, they found themselves increasingly lost as the afternoon wore on, the network of faint trails leading them in circles through terrain that all looked the same. The drizzle had intensified into a steady rain, soaking through their jackets and making their packs feel heavier with each step. By the time they admitted they were lost, the daylight was beginning to fade, and they faced the prospect of spending a night in the wilderness without the comfort of their planned campsite. Marcus tried to maintain his composure as the leader of their group, but privately he was beginning to panic. These mountains could be unforgiving, and they were miles from any marked trail or ranger station. The temperature was dropping with the approaching darkness, and they needed to find shelter quickly. Tommy's jokes had dried up entirely, replaced by nervous silence, while David methodically checked and rechecked their supplies, calculating how long their food and water would last if they remained lost. It was Tommy who spotted the cabin first, a dark shape barely visible through the trees in the gathering dusk. At first glance, it appeared to be abandoned, a weathered structure that looked like it might have been built decades earlier and left to the mercy of the mountain weather. But as they approached cautiously, they could see that someone had been maintaining it. The roof was intact, the windows were covered with thick boards, and there was a neat stack of firewood beside the front door. The decision to approach the cabin would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. In that moment, cold and lost and facing a night in the mountains without adequate shelter, it seemed like a miracle. They told themselves they would just ask for directions, maybe permission to shelter on the porch until morning. They had no way of knowing that they were walking into a nightmare that would destroy their friendship and change their lives forever. The door opened before they could knock, revealing a man who seemed to have stepped out of another century. Tall and gaunt, with wild grey hair and eyes that reflected the dying light like an animal's, he studied them with an intensity that made their skin crawl. His clothes were patched and worn, but clean, and when he spoke, his voice carried the distinctive accent of someone who had been born and raised in these mountains. "You boys look lost," he said, his tone neutral, but his eyes never leaving their faces. "These woods ain't safe for folks who don't know their way around. Lot of dangerous things out here in the dark." His words carried an implication that went beyond the usual concerns about wildlife or rough terrain, and all three friends felt an immediate urge to back away from the cabin and its occupant. But the rain was falling harder now, and the temperature was dropping rapidly as night approached. Marcus found himself accepting the man's reluctant invitation to come inside and warm themselves by his fire, a decision that would replay in his mind like a broken record for years to come. The interior of the cabin was sparse but organized, with handmade furniture and shelves lined with mason jars containing preserved foods and mysterious liquids. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls that were decorated with animal skulls and what appeared to be old photographs. The man introduced himself only as Ezra and claimed to have been living in these mountains for more than 20 years, completely cut off from the outside world. He seemed genuinely curious about their lives in town, asking detailed questions about people and places that suggested he had once been part of the community they called home. But there was something unsettling about his interest, a hunger in his questions that made them uncomfortable, even as they gratefully accepted his hospitality. As the evening wore on, Ezra's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would lapse into long silences, staring at them with an intensity that made their skin crawl, then suddenly launch into rambling monologues about the corruption of modern society and the purity of life in the wilderness. He spoke of visitors who had come to his cabin over the years, people who had lost their way, just as they had, but when pressed for details about what had happened to these other travelers, his answers became vague and contradictory. The friends had planned to leave at first light, but when morning came, they discovered that their backpacks had been moved during the night. Their supplies were still there, but the contents had been rearranged, and some items, including David's compass and Marcus's detailed topographic map, were mysteriously missing. When they confronted Ezra about the missing items, he claimed to know nothing about it, suggesting that they might have misplaced the items themselves in their exhaustion the night before. It was then that Tommy noticed the photographs on Ezra's wall more closely. Mixed in with old family pictures and landscape shots were more recent images, candid shots of hikers and campers, apparently taken without their knowledge from concealment in the forest. Some of the people in the photographs looked frightened, as if they had sensed they were being watched. Others appeared to be sleeping in their tents, unaware that they were being documented by someone lurking in the darkness outside their campsites. The realization that they had stumbled into the domain of someone who had been stalking and photographing visitors to the forest for years sent a chill through all three friends. They began to understand that their situation was far more dangerous than they had initially realized, and that Ezra had no intention of simply giving them directions and sending them on their way. They were trapped, miles from help, at the mercy of someone whose grip on reality appeared to be tenuous at best. David was the first to suggest that they needed to leave immediately, with or without their missing navigational tools. But when they moved toward the door, they found that Ezra had positioned himself to block their exit, his demeanor shifting from eccentric hospitality to something far more threatening. His eyes had taken on a wild quality, and when he spoke, his voice carried a tone of authority that brooked no argument. "You can't leave yet," he said, his words echoing in the confined space of the cabin. "You haven't learned what you came here to learn. The mountains have lessons to teach you, lessons about what's really important in life. Your old friendships, they're just distractions from the truth." His words made no sense to them, but the conviction with which he spoke them made it clear that he believed every word. What followed was a psychological siege that lasted for 3 more days. Ezra kept them in the cabin through a combination of veiled threats, manipulation, and the simple reality that they were lost in territory he knew intimately, while they knew not at all. He alternated between treating them as honored guests and prisoners, cooking elaborate meals for them one moment, and ranting about their moral failings the next. During this time, he subjected them to hours of rambling lectures about the corruption of modern society and the purity of life in the wilderness. He spoke of his own transformation from a member of civilized society to someone who had achieved a higher level of understanding through isolation and communion with nature. But his stories were inconsistent and often contradictory, suggesting a mind that had been damaged by years of solitude and possibly by experiences that had driven him to seek such complete isolation in the first place. The friends tried multiple times to escape, but each attempt was thwarted by Ezra's intimate knowledge of the surrounding terrain and their own complete disorientation. The few times they managed to slip away from the cabin, they found themselves hopelessly lost within hours, eventually forced to return to the only landmark they could find. Ezra seemed to anticipate their every move, appearing out of the forest like a spectre whenever they thought they had finally gotten away. On the 4th night of their captivity, everything changed. Tommy had been growing increasingly agitated as the days wore on, his natural optimism cracking under the strain of their situation. He had been the one pushing hardest for another escape attempt, arguing that anything was better than remaining prisoners in Ezra's increasingly unstable world. But that night, as they huddled together in the single room where Ezra forced them to sleep, Tommy made a confession that shattered the bond between the 3 friends forever. In a whispered conversation that he thought the others couldn't hear, Tommy revealed that he had been in contact with Ezra for months before their camping trip. What had started as an accidental encounter during a solo hike the previous spring had developed into a strange correspondence, with Tommy leaving messages at predetermined locations in the forest and receiving rambling responses that initially seemed like harmless eccentricity from a mountain hermit. But as the relationship had developed, Ezra had begun to express increasingly disturbing ideas about the corruption of modern friendship and the need to test the bonds between people through extreme circumstances. He had convinced Tommy that their friendship was shallow and meaningless, built on convenience and shared experiences rather than true loyalty and understanding. The camping trip, Tommy admitted, had been orchestrated from the beginning as a test, a way to see whether their friendship could survive under pressure. Marcus and David listened in horror as Tommy revealed the depth of his betrayal. He had provided Ezra with detailed information about their planned route, their camping experience, and their individual personalities. He had helped plan their capture, believing Ezra's assurances that it would be a temporary experience that would ultimately strengthen their bond as friends. But now, faced with the reality of what he had helped to create, Tommy was beginning to understand that Ezra's intentions were far darker than he had been led to believe. The revelation destroyed the last vestiges of trust between the three friends. Marcus and David realized that every aspect of their situation had been orchestrated, that their friend had sold them out to a madman for reasons they couldn't begin to understand. The betrayal cut deeper than their fear of Ezra, striking at the foundation of relationships they had believed were unshakable. But there was no time to process the full implications of Tommy's confession, because Ezra had been listening to their whispered conversation from the shadows. His reaction to Tommy's admission was swift and violent, revealing the extent of his mental instability and the danger they were all in. What happened next would be burned into the memory of the sole survivor for the rest of his life, a sequence of events so traumatic that he would spend years trying to forget them. In the chaos that followed, Marcus and David made a desperate break for freedom, crashing through the cabin door and into the forest darkness. Behind them, they could hear Tommy screaming, whether in fear or pain they couldn't tell, but they didn't stop to look back. Their only thought was escape, getting away from the nightmare their camping trip had become, and finding help for their betrayed friend, despite what he had done to them. They ran blindly through the forest, branches tearing at their clothes and faces, their hearts pounding with terror and adrenaline. Behind them, they could hear Ezra crashing through the underbrush in pursuit, his voice echoing through the trees as he called out threats and promises of what would happen when he caught them. The sounds of the chase seemed to come from all directions, as if the forest itself had turned against them. Marcus and David became separated in the darkness, each following his own desperate path through terrain that seemed designed to trap and confuse them. The last time they saw each other was at the edge of a steep ravine, where they paused for just a moment to catch their breath and try to get their bearings. David pointed toward what he thought might be a way down to the valley floor, while Marcus insisted they should try to find higher ground where they might be able to see lights from the town. They agreed to meet at the bottom of the ravine if they became separated, but that reunion never happened. The forest swallowed them both, and neither Marcus nor David was ever seen again. Their disappearance would become one of the most intensive search efforts in the history of the North Carolina mountains, involving hundreds of volunteers, professional search and rescue teams, and law enforcement agencies from multiple jurisdictions. Tommy emerged from the forest 3 days later, stumbling onto a hiking trail miles from where they had originally entered the wilderness. He was dehydrated, hypothermic, and in a state of psychological shock that made it difficult for him to provide coherent information about what had happened to his friends. His clothes were torn and blood-stained, and he bore scratches and bruises that suggested he had spent days fighting his way through dense undergrowth. His story to the authorities was fragmented and inconsistent, changing with each retelling as investigators tried to piece together the events that had led to the disappearance of Marcus and David. He spoke of becoming separated from his friends during a storm, of spending days lost in the wilderness, of hearing voices calling his name from the darkness. But he never mentioned Ezra or the cabin, claiming to have no memory of how he had acquired his injuries or why he was found so far from their intended camping area. The search for Marcus and David continued for weeks, involving helicopter surveys, search dogs, and teams of experienced mountaineers who combed every accessible inch of the forest where the friends had last been seen. They found scattered pieces of camping equipment and a few items of clothing, but no trace of the missing young men themselves. The wilderness had claimed them as completely as if they had never existed. Tommy's behavior in the weeks and months following the disappearance raised questions among those who knew him best. He became withdrawn and paranoid, jumping at unexpected sounds and refusing to discuss the details of their camping trip. He quit his job and moved away from Blowing Rock within a month of the incident, claiming that he needed to start over somewhere where he wouldn't be constantly reminded of his lost friends. But those who observed him closely noticed that his departure seemed driven more by guilt than by grief. The families of Marcus and David never stopped believing that Tommy knew more about their son's disappearance than he was willing to admit. They hired private investigators and pressured law enforcement to continue pursuing the case long after it had been officially classified as a cold case. But without new evidence or testimony, there was little anyone could do except hope that someday the truth would emerge. Years passed, and the disappearance of Marcus Webb and David Chen became part of local folklore, a cautionary tale told to warn hikers about the dangers of venturing too deep into the wilderness without proper preparation and communication with the outside world. The case file remained open, but active investigations ceased as other priorities demanded the attention of overworked law enforcement agencies. Tommy Rodriguez disappeared into a new life, changing his name and moving to different cities every few years, as if trying to stay ahead of something that pursued him. He worked a series of temporary jobs, never staying in one place long enough to form meaningful relationships or attract attention to his past. But the weight of what he had done and what he had witnessed followed him like a shadow. The truth about what happened in those mountains remained buried for nearly 15 years, locked away in the traumatized mind of the only person who knew the complete story. It would take a chance encounter and a moment of desperate need for Tommy to finally confront the demons that had been haunting him since that terrible autumn in 1987. In the spring of 2002, Tommy Rodriguez was living under the name Thomas Rivera in a small apartment in Asheville, North Carolina, working as a maintenance worker at a local hospital. He had been drawn back to the mountains despite his best efforts to stay away, pulled by a combination of guilt and an inexplicable need to be near the place where his friends had vanished. He told himself that he was monitoring the situation, waiting for some sign that the truth might emerge, but in reality, he was slowly destroying himself with alcohol and isolation. It was during this period that he encountered Sarah Webb, Marcus's younger sister, who had never stopped searching for answers about her brother's disappearance. She had become a private investigator partly because of her frustration with the official investigation, and she had spent years following leads and interviewing anyone connected to the case. When she spotted Tommy at a grocery store in Asheville, she knew immediately who he was, despite the years that had passed and the changes that guilt and alcohol had wrought on his appearance. Their confrontation was brief but explosive, taking place in the parking lot of the store, where other shoppers looked on in confusion as Sarah accused Tommy of lying about what had happened to her brother. She had evidence, she claimed, new information that contradicted his original story and suggested that he had been involved in something far more sinister than a simple hiking accident. The details she revealed made it clear that she had been investigating not just the disappearance, but Tommy's actions in the years that followed. Faced with the possibility that his carefully constructed new identity was about to be exposed, Tommy made a decision that would finally bring the truth to light. He agreed to meet with Sarah and tell her everything he knew about what had happened in the mountains 15 years earlier. But he demanded certain protections, immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony, and guarantees that the focus would be on finding Ezra rather than punishing him for his role in the events. The confession that followed was more horrific than anyone had imagined. Tommy revealed the full extent of his collaboration with Ezra, the psychological manipulation that had led him to betray his best friends, and the violence that had erupted when the plan had gone wrong. He provided detailed information about the location of Ezra's cabin and the evidence that might still be found there, including photographs and personal items taken from other victims over the years. But most importantly, he revealed what had actually happened to Marcus and David during their final desperate flight through the forest. The truth was more tragic and more complex than the simple story of two friends lost in the wilderness that had been accepted for so many years. Both young men had survived their initial escape from Ezra's cabin, but their fate had been sealed by a series of tragic decisions and unfortunate circumstances that Tommy had been forced to witness. Marcus had fallen into the ravine that he and David had been trying to navigate in the darkness, suffering injuries that would have been survivable under normal circumstances, but proved fatal in their isolated location. David had managed to reach his friend and had stayed with him despite the danger, refusing to abandon Marcus, even when it became clear that they were both going to die if help didn't arrive soon. Tommy had found them both 2 days later, following the sounds of David's increasingly desperate calls for help. By then, Marcus was unconscious and failing rapidly from internal injuries and exposure, while David was exhausted and hypothermic from his vigil beside his dying friend. Tommy's arrival should have been their salvation, but instead it became the final act in a tragedy that his betrayal had set in motion. Ezra had followed Tommy to the ravine, arriving just as Tommy was trying to help David get Marcus to safety. What happened next was a confrontation that revealed the full extent of Ezra's madness and the danger that all three friends had been in from the moment they encountered him. The hermit's reaction to finding his carefully orchestrated test disrupted by genuine friendship and loyalty was swift and violent. Tommy's description of the final moments of his friends' lives was almost too painful for Sarah to hear, but she forced herself to listen as he described David's desperate attempt to protect the unconscious Marcus and the brutal efficiency with which Ezra had ended both their lives. The guilt that had been eating away at Tommy for 15 years was not just about his betrayal, but about his failure to save his friends when he finally had the chance. Ezra had forced Tommy to help dispose of the bodies, threatening him with the same fate if he refused to cooperate. Together, they had carried Marcus and David deeper into the wilderness, to a place where Ezra claimed other visitors to his domain had been laid to rest over the years. The location was remote and well hidden, accessible only to someone with intimate knowledge of the mountain terrain. But Ezra's plan to keep Tommy as a permanent resident of his mountain kingdom had been thwarted by the intensive search effort that began when Tommy failed to return home as scheduled. The arrival of search helicopters and rescue teams had forced Ezra to release his last captive, but not before extracting promises of silence and threats of retribution if Tommy ever revealed what had happened in the mountains. Tommy's emergence from the forest and his subsequent lies to investigators had been motivated by a combination of fear and guilt that made it impossible for him to tell the truth. He genuinely believed that Ezra would find him anywhere he went, and that revealing the truth would only result in more deaths. But he also couldn't escape the knowledge that his betrayal had been the catalyst for everything that followed. The information Tommy provided to Sarah and the authorities led to the most intensive manhunt in the region's history. Teams of law enforcement officers, accompanied by Tommy as a reluctant guide, returned to the remote area where Ezra had maintained his cabin for more than 2 decades. What they found there was evidence of crimes that went far beyond the deaths of Marcus Webb and David Chen. Ezra's cabin was a museum of obsession and violence, filled with photographs, personal items, and documentation of encounters with hikers and campers stretching back more than 20 years. The evidence suggested that Marcus and David had been far from his first victims, and that the hermit had been preying on visitors to the remote areas of the forest for decades. But Ezra himself was nowhere to be found. The cabin showed signs of hasty abandonment, as if he had fled shortly after Tommy's confession became public. The manhunt that followed involved multiple law enforcement agencies and lasted for months, but the mountains that had hidden Ezra for so long continued to protect him from those who sought to bring him to justice. Tommy's confession brought closure to the families of Marcus and David, but it also opened old wounds and raised new questions about the failures of the original investigation. The revelation that one of the victims had actually been a collaborator in his friend's deaths created a complex legal and moral situation that had no clear resolution. Tommy was ultimately granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for his cooperation, but he remained a pariah in the community where he had grown up. The bodies of Marcus Webb and David Chen were eventually recovered from the remote location Tommy had described, allowing their families to finally lay them to rest after 15 years of uncertainty. The forensic evidence confirmed Tommy's account of their deaths, providing painful closure to questions that had haunted their loved ones for so long. Sarah Webb's investigation had finally provided the answers she had been seeking, but the truth was more devastating than she had ever imagined. The knowledge that her brother had died not in a simple hiking accident, but as the victim of a premeditated crime orchestrated by one of his best friends, was almost more than she could bear. But she also found some comfort in learning that Marcus had died trying to help his friend, remaining true to his values even in his final moments. The case of the 3 camping friends became a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk in even the most familiar wilderness areas, and about the fragility of trust between friends. But it also highlighted the resilience of families who refuse to give up hope, and the power of truth to eventually emerge even from the darkest circumstances. Tommy Rodriguez never returned to the mountains where his friends had died, but he also never escaped the weight of what he had done. He spent his remaining years moving from place to place, working temporary jobs and avoiding meaningful relationships. The immunity he had received protected him from legal consequences, but it could not protect him from the psychological damage of carrying such a terrible secret for so long. Ezra was never captured, despite extensive efforts by law enforcement agencies and private investigators. Some believe he died in the wilderness he had claimed as his domain, while others suspect he simply moved to more remote areas where he could continue his predatory behavior undetected. The case remains officially open, and investigators continue to receive occasional tips and sightings, but the hermit who terrorized the mountains of North Carolina has never been brought to justice. The disappearance and eventual solution of the case of Marcus Webb and David Chen serves as a reminder that the wilderness can hide secrets for decades, and that the truth, no matter how painful, has a way of eventually coming to light. It also stands as a testament to the determination of families who refuse to accept that their loved ones are simply gone and who continue to search for answers long after others have given up hope. The mountains of North Carolina continue to attract hikers and campers seeking the beauty and solitude that the wilderness can provide. But those who venture into the remote areas where Ezra once maintained his domain carry with them the knowledge that some secrets are darker than anything they might encounter in the natural world, and that the greatest dangers sometimes come not from the wilderness itself, but from the troubled minds of those who seek to escape from civilization entirely. The story of 3 friends who went camping and became entangled in a web of manipulation, betrayal, and violence serves as a reminder that trust is precious and fragile, and that the consequences of betraying that trust can echo through decades. It also demonstrates that even in the darkest circumstances, the bonds of true friendship can endure, as evidenced by David's refusal to abandon the injured Marcus, even when it meant sacrificing his own chance of survival. Years later, when Tommy Rodriguez died alone in a small apartment in Florida, investigators found among his possessions a collection of newspaper clippings about the case, photographs of his lost friends, and a journal documenting his struggles with guilt and addiction. His final entry, written just days before his death, contained a simple message, an apology to Marcus and David, and an expression of hope that he might someday find the peace that had eluded him for so long. The case file remains open, a reminder that some mysteries span decades and that justice sometimes comes in forms that no one expects. The families of the victims have found a measure of peace in finally knowing the truth about what happened to their loved ones. But they continue to hope that someday Ezra will be found and held accountable for his crimes. The wilderness of the North Carolina mountains continues to guard its secrets, but the story of Marcus Webb, David Chen, and Tommy Rodriguez serves as a powerful reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of eventually surfacing. It also stands as a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of never giving up hope, and the complex nature of human relationships that can encompass both the deepest loyalty and the most devastating betrayal.